the most dangerous punishments of World War II. Imagine being a soldier. You've survived artillery, gunfire, hunger, and frostbite. And then you make one mistake. You retreat a few meters without an order, or you fall asleep on watch. Your own army decides your death sentence right there on the spot. World War II wasn't only fought against the enemy. For millions of soldiers, one of the greatest dangers came from their own military justice systems. Today we're looking at the most brutal, most feared punishments handed out during the deadliest war in human history. Punishments so harsh they killed more of their own men than some battles did. Let's get into it. 1. The Soviet Union. Order No. 227. Nowhere was military discipline more terrifying than in the Soviet Red Army. In the summer of 1942, with German forces pushing deep into Soviet territory and threatening Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin issued one of the most infamous military orders in history. Order number 227, better known by its chilling nickname, Not One Step Back. The order was simple and merciless. Any commander who allowed unauthorized retreat would be considered a traitor to the motherland. Panic and cowardice were to be crushed on the spot. There was no room for excuses, no room for fear. If you retreated without permission, you could be executed immediately by your own officers. This order created two of the most feared institutions of the entire war. Penal battalions, the SH Strafbat. The first were the Penal Battalions, known in Russian as SH Strafbat. These units were made up of soldiers who had committed crimes, desertion, cowardice, insubordination, even minor infractions. And instead of prison or execution, they were given one brutal alternative: fight on the front lines in the most dangerous missions imaginable. Penal battalion soldiers were sent to clear minefields by walking across them. They were thrown into the first waves of suicidal assaults. They had almost no chance of survival, and that was the point. Their redemption was measured in blood. Officers who had once commanded regiments could find themselves demoted to private and fighting alongside common criminals, with the unspoken understanding that few of them would live to see reassignment. Barrier troops standing behind the line of death. The second terrifying creation of Order 227 was the Zagraditli Otriadi, or barrier troops, sometimes called blocking detachments. These were special NKVD units stationed directly behind the front line with one job: shoot any Soviet soldier who tried to retreat without authorization. Picture the horror of that position. You're a soldier facing German machine guns and artillery in front of you, and behind you, your own countrymen with orders to kill you if you run. There was no safe direction. Historians still debate exactly how many soldiers were executed by barrier troops, but wartime records suggest thousands were shot for retreating, panicking, or simply being in the wrong place during a collapse in the line. This system of terror-based discipline was one of the reasons the Red Army was able to hold its ground during some of the most catastrophic battles in history. But the human cost paid by its own soldiers was staggering. To Nazi Germany, the Wehrmacht's iron discipline. The German military machine was famous for its efficiency, and its military justice system was just as ruthless when it came to enforcing obedience. Historians estimate that the Wehrmacht executed somewhere between 15 and 20,000 of its own soldiers during the war for offenses like desertion, self-mutilation to avoid combat, defeatist talk, or undermining military morale. Compare that to the First World War, when the German military executed only a small handful of its own men. The difference shows just how much harsher Nazi military discipline became. Bewährungsbataillon, the probation battalions. Like the Soviets, the Germans had their own version of penal units, called Bewährungsbataillon or probation battalions. Soldiers convicted of military crimes were sent to these units and given brutal assignments, clearing mines, holding hopeless defensive positions, or being used in the most dangerous frontline operations. Survival was treated as a form of proving loyalty to the Reich. Field courts and snap executions. As Germany's military situation deteriorated in 1944 and 1945, punishments became even more extreme. Roving military courts, sometimes called flying courts-martial, could sentence a soldier to death within hours for something as small as being separated from his unit during chaos, and executions were sometimes carried out immediately, with the body left on display as a warning to others. Toward the end of the war, being caught without proper papers while retreating could be a death sentence, no trial required. 3. Imperial Japan. Shame, beatings, and death before dishonor. The Imperial Japanese military operated under an entirely different philosophy of discipline, one rooted in the idea that shame was worse than death. Everyday brutality. Physical punishment was baked into daily military life. New recruits could expect regular beatings from superiors for the smallest infractions, a practice sometimes called binta, or face slapping, that was used almost casually to enforce obedience. Discipline wasn't reserved for major crimes. It was a constant, physical part of a soldier's existence from his very first day of training. Surrender was the ultimate crime. But the most dangerous punishment in the Japanese military wasn't official at all. It was cultural. Soldiers were indoctrinated to believe that surrender was the deepest possible dishonor, not just to themselves, but to their families back home. This belief was so deeply enforced that soldiers frequently fought to the death rather than surrender, and some units carried out mass suicides rather than be captured. In a twisted sense, the fear of shame functioned as a punishment far more powerful than any court-martial. Soldiers policed themselves and each other, sometimes to horrifying extremes. Officers also had wide personal authority to punish subordinates however they saw fit, which meant discipline could range from humiliating physical punishment to summary execution, depending entirely on the temperament of the commanding officer. 4. The Western Allies, rarer but still deadly. It's worth noting that not every military relied on terror to the same extreme degree. The British and American militaries also had the death penalty for offenses like desertion, but used it far more sparingly. The case of Eddie Slovik. The United States executed only one of its own soldiers for desertion during the entire war, Private Eddie Slovik, shot by firing squad in January 1945. His case became infamous precisely because it was so rare. Over 20,000 American soldiers were convicted of desertion during the war, and Slovik was the only one executed, making his death a stark example used to enforce discipline through fear rather than routine practice. Britain. The British Army had actually abolished the death penalty for military cowardice and desertion after the lessons learned from the First World War, relying instead on imprisonment and hard labor. Discipline was still strict, but the wholesale executions seen in Soviet and German ranks were largely absent from the British approach. 5. The Gulag and POW punishment systems. Beyond battlefield discipline, punishment extended into the massive prison camp systems on both sides. Soviet soldiers who were captured by the Germans and later liberated were frequently treated with suspicion rather than sympathy. Many returning POWs were interrogated and sent to labor camps in the Gulag system, accused of potential collaboration simply for having been captured. Surviving the horror of a German POW camp could mean walking straight into a Soviet one instead. On the other side, Axis POW camps varied wildly in brutality, from relatively survivable Western Front camps to horrific conditions on the Eastern Front and in Japanese-run camps, where prisoners faced forced labor, starvation, and physical abuse as routine, not exceptional, treatment. 6. Why this matters. When we think about World War II, we usually think about battles, generals, and turning points. But the internal discipline systems of these armies shaped the war just as much as any weapon. The Soviet Union's willingness to shoot its own retreating soldiers helped stabilize collapsing front lines at horrific human cost. Nazi Germany's escalating executions reflected a regime turning on its own people as defeat closed in. Japan's culture of shame produced soldiers who would rather die than surrender, extending some of the war's bloodiest battles far beyond what pure strategy would predict. These punishment systems remind us that, for millions of ordinary soldiers, danger didn't only come from the enemy trench across the field. Sometimes it came from the officer standing behind them. Outro Call to Action. That's a look at some of the most brutal and feared punishment systems of World War II. If you found this video interesting, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with which one shocked you the most. Was it the Soviet barrier troops or Japan's culture of shame? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.